Ontology is the study of being, forming a crucial branch of philosophy that delves into the nature of existence, the common features shared by all entities, and the basic categories into which these entities are divided. It seeks to uncover the foundational building blocks of the world, aiming to characterize reality in its most general aspects. Unlike individual sciences such as biology and astronomy, which focus on specific domains like living entities and celestial phenomena, ontology pursues a broader understanding of existence as a whole. In some contexts, ontology refers not to the general study of being but to a specific theory within this discipline or a conceptual scheme of a particular domain. The term has its roots in the ancient Greek words, ontos, meaning being, and logia, meaning study of, though it was not used by the ancient Greeks themselves, and was coined by philosophers in the 17th century. Ontology is closely related to metaphysics, but the exact relationship between the two is a matter of debate. Traditionally, metaphysics is seen as the study of fundamental reality in the broadest sense, with ontology as a subdiscipline focusing on the most general features of reality. This view distinguishes ontology, or general metaphysics, from special metaphysics, which addresses more specific topics like God, mind, and values. Alternatively, some conceptions position ontology as a preliminary discipline that provides a complete inventory of reality, while metaphysics examines the structure and features of the entities within this inventory. Another perspective suggests that metaphysics is concerned with real being, whereas ontology examines possible being or the concept of being. Despite these distinctions, the boundary between metaphysics and ontology is not universally agreed upon, with some philosophers using the terms interchangeably. Being or existence is the main topic of ontology, encompassing the entirety of reality and every entity within it. In its broadest sense, being contrasts with non-being or nothingness. Whether a deeper analysis of the concept of being is possible remains a subject of debate. One perspective posits that being is a property possessed by every entity. Critics of this view argue that an entity without being cannot possess any properties, meaning being cannot be a property since properties presuppose being. Another suggestion proposes that all beings share a set of essential features. The Eleatic principle states that power is the mark of being, implying that only entities with causal influence truly exist. A controversial view by philosopher George Berkeley asserts that all existence is mental, encapsulated in his slogan "To be is to be perceived." The term being is sometimes used more narrowly to refer to specific aspects of reality. In one sense, being is unchanging and permanent, contrasted with becoming, which implies change. Another distinction is between being, as what truly exists, and phenomena, as what merely appears to exist. In some contexts, being denotes the fact that something exists, while essence refers to its qualities or what it is like. Ontologists often classify being into fundamental categories or highest kinds, such as substance, property, relation, state of affairs, and event. These categories form systems that provide a comprehensive inventory of reality, where every entity belongs to exactly one category. Some philosophers, like Aristotle, argue that entities in different categories exist in distinct ways, while others, like John Duns Scotus, maintain that everything exists in the same way. There is also debate over whether some entities have a higher degree of being than others, an idea dating back to Plato. However, the prevailing view in contemporary philosophy is that existence is binary. A thing either exists or does not, with no intermediary states or degrees. A central distinction in ontology is between particular and universal entities. Particulars, also known as individuals, are unique and non-repeatable entities, such as Socrates, the Taj Mahal, and Mars. Universals, on the other hand, are general and repeatable entities, like the color green, the form circularity, and the virtue courage. Universals express aspects or features shared by particulars. For example, Mount Everest and Mount Fuji are particulars characterized by the universal mountain. Universals can manifest as properties or relations. Properties describe what entities are like, representing features or qualities possessed by an entity. These are often divided into essential and accidental properties. A property is essential if an entity must have it to exist. It is accidental if the entity can exist without it. For instance, Having three sides is an essential property of a triangle, while being red is an accidental property. Relations, unlike properties, describe how two or more entities stand in relation to one another, applying to multiple entities and characterizing them as a group. For example, being a city is a property, while being east of is a relation, as in Kathmandu is a city and Kathmandu is east of New Delhi. Relations are often categorized into internal and external relations. Internal relations depend solely on the properties of the objects they connect, such as the relation of resemblance. External relations, however, involve characteristics that go beyond the intrinsic properties of the connected objects, such as spatial relations. Substances play an important role in the history of ontology as the particular entities that underlie and support properties and relations. They are often considered the fundamental building blocks of reality, capable of existing on their own, unlike properties and relations, which cannot exist independently. Substances persist through changes as they acquire or lose properties. For example, when a tomato ripens, it loses the property of being green and acquires the property of being red. States of affairs are complex particular entities comprising several other entities as their components. The state of affairs Socrates is wise includes two components, the individual Socrates and the property of being wise. States of affairs that correspond to reality are referred to as facts. Facts serve as truth makers for statements, meaning that the truth or falsity of a statement depends on the underlying facts. Events are particular entities that occur in time, such as the fall of the Berlin Wall or the first moon landing. Events typically involve some form of change, like the lawn becoming dry. In some instances, no change occurs, such as the lawn remaining wet. Complex events, also known as processes, consist of a sequence of events. Understanding substances, states of affairs, and events is crucial in ontology as it helps clarify how different entities and their interactions constitute reality. Substances provide the stable foundation upon which properties and relations depend. States of affairs and facts link entities and their properties to the truth of statements, grounding our understanding of truth in the world. Events and processes highlight the dynamic nature of reality, showing how changes and sequences of occurrences shape the temporal aspect of existence. Concrete objects are entities that exist in space and time, such as a tree, a car, and a planet. They possess causal powers and can affect each other, for instance, when a car hits a tree and both are deformed in the process. In contrast, abstract objects exist outside space and time, like the number 7 and the set of integers. Abstract objects lack causal powers and do not undergo changes. It is controversial whether or in what sense abstract objects exist and how people can know about them. Concrete objects encountered in everyday life are complex entities composed of various parts. For example, a book consists of two covers and pages between them. Each of these components is itself constituted of smaller parts, such as molecules, atoms, and elementary particles. Mereology is the study of the relations between parts and wholes. One position in mereology asserts that every collection of entities forms a whole. Another view holds that this is only the case for collections that meet certain requirements, such as the entities in the collection touching one another. The problem of material constitution addresses whether or in what sense a whole should be considered a new object in addition to the collection of parts composing it. Abstract objects are closely related to fictional and intentional objects. Fictional objects are entities invented in works of fiction. They can be things, like the One Ring in J.R.R. Tolkien's book series The Lord of the Rings, and people, like the Monkey King in the novel Journey to the West. Some philosophers consider fictional objects as a type of abstract object, existing outside space and time. Others understand them as artifacts created when the works of fiction are written. Intentional objects are entities that exist within mental states, such as perceptions, beliefs, and desires. For example, if a person thinks about the Loch Ness Monster, then the Loch Ness Monster is the intentional object of this thought. People can think about both existing and non-existing objects, complicating the assessment of the ontological status of intentional objects. This intersection of abstract, fictional, and intentional objects opens up complex debates about the nature of existence and the criteria for an entity's ontological status. Ontological dependence is a relation between entities, in which one entity cannot exist without another. For instance, the surface of an apple cannot exist without the apple. An entity that is ontologically independent does not depend on anything else, and is considered fundamental, capable of existing on its own. Ontological dependence plays a central role in ontology, helping to describe reality at its most fundamental level. It is closely related to metaphysical grounding, the relationship between a ground and the facts it explains. An ontological commitment refers to the entities that a person or theory acknowledges as existing. For example, a person who believes in God has an ontological commitment to God. Ontological commitments are used to analyze the explicit or implicit assumptions in various ontologies, playing a crucial role in contemporary metaphysics when deciding between competing theories. The Quine-Putnam indispensability argument, for instance, defends mathematical Platonism by asserting that numbers exist because the best scientific theories are ontologically committed to them. Possibility and necessity are further topics in ontology. Possibility describes what can be the case, such as it is possible that extraterrestrial life exists. Necessity describes what must be the case, such as it is necessary that 3 + 2 = 5. These concepts contrast with actuality, which describes what is the case, as in Doha is the capital of Qatar. Ontologists often use the concept of possible worlds to analyze possibility and necessity. A possible world is a complete and consistent way things could have been. For example, while Haruki Murakami was born in 1949 in the actual world, there are possible worlds in which he was born on a different date. According to possible world semantics, a sentence is possibly true if it is true in at least one possible world, and necessarily true if it is true in all possible worlds. In ontology, identity means that two things are the same. Philosophers distinguish between qualitative and numerical identity. Two entities are qualitatively identical if they have exactly the same features, such as perfectly identical twins. This is also called exact similarity and indiscernibility. Numerical identity, by contrast, means that there is only a single entity. For example, if Fatima is the mother of both Layla and Hugo, then Layla's mother is numerically identical to Hugo's mother. Another distinction is between synchronic and diachronic identity. Synchronic identity relates an entity to itself at the same time, while diachronic identity relates an entity to itself at different times. For instance, the woman who bore Layla 3 years ago is the same woman who bore Hugo this year, demonstrates diachronic identity. Understanding these concepts helps ontologists explore the criteria for an entity's identity, and how entities persist or change over time. The term realism is used for various theories that affirm that some kind of phenomenon is real or has a mind-independent existence. Ontological realism is the view that there are objective facts about what exists and what the nature and categories of being are. Ontological realists do not make specific claims about what those facts are, such as whether elementary particles exist. They merely state that there are mind-independent facts that determine which ontological theories are true. This idea is denied by ontological anti-realists, also called ontological deflationists, who argue that there are no substantive facts one way or the other. According to philosopher Rudolf Carnap, for example, ontological statements are relative to language and depend on the ontological framework of the speaker. This means that there are no framework-independent ontological facts, since different frameworks provide different views, and there is no objectively right or wrong framework. In a more narrow sense, realism refers to the existence of certain types of entities. Realists about universals assert that universals have a mind-independent existence. Platonic realists believe that universals exist not only independent of the mind but also independent of particular objects that exemplify them. This means that the universal red could exist by itself even if there were no red objects in the world. Aristotelian realism, also known as moderate realism, rejects this idea and maintains that universals only exist as long as there are objects that exemplify them. Conceptualism, by contrast, is a form of anti-realism, positing that universals only exist in the mind as concepts that people use to understand and categorize the world. Nominalists defend a strong form of anti-realism by claiming that universals have no existence at all. According to nominalists, the world is entirely composed of particular objects, and what we refer to as universals are merely names or labels we use to group similar objects together. These debates between realists and anti-realists extend to various domains within ontology, reflecting different perspectives on the nature of existence and the status of entities. Mathematical realism, a closely related view in the philosophy of mathematics, posits that mathematical facts exist independently of human language, thought, and practices and are discovered rather than invented. According to mathematical Platonism, this is the case because of the existence of mathematical objects like numbers and sets. Mathematical Platonists argue that these mathematical objects are as real as physical objects, like atoms and stars, even though they are not accessible to empirical observation. Influential forms of mathematical anti-realism include conventionalism, which asserts that mathematical theories are trivially true simply by how mathematical terms are defined, and game formalism, which understands mathematics not as a theory of reality but as a game governed by rules of string manipulation. Modal realism is the theory that in addition to the actual world, there are countless possible worlds that are as real and concrete as the actual world. The primary difference is that the actual world is inhabited by us, while other possible worlds are inhabited by our counterparts. Modal anti-realists reject this view and argue that possible worlds do not have concrete reality, but exist in a different sense, for example, as abstract or fictional objects. Scientific realists maintain that the scientific description of the world is an accurate representation of reality. This view is particularly relevant regarding entities that cannot be directly observed by humans but are posited by scientific theories, such as electrons, forces, and laws of nature. Scientific anti-realism contends that scientific theories are not descriptions of reality, but instruments for predicting observations and the outcomes of experiments. Moral realists claim that there exist mind-independent moral facts. According to them, objective principles determine which behaviors are morally right. Moral anti-realists either claim that moral principles are subjective and differ between persons and cultures, a position known as moral relativism, or outright deny the existence of moral facts, a view referred to as moral nihilism. These various forms of realism and anti-realism reflect deep philosophical divisions regarding the nature of different domains of reality, such as mathematics, modality, science, and morality. Each of these domains brings its own unique set of issues and debates about whether the entities and facts within them exist independently of human thought and perception, or whether they are dependent on our conceptual frameworks and practices. Monocategorical theories assert that there is only one fundamental category, meaning that every single entity belongs to the same universal class. For example, some forms of nominalism state that only concrete particulars exist, while some forms of bundle theory assert that only properties exist. Polycategorical theories, by contrast, hold that there is more than one basic category, meaning that entities are divided into two or more fundamental classes. These theories take the form of systems of categories, which list the highest genera of being to provide a comprehensive inventory of everything. The closely related discussion between monism and dualism addresses the most fundamental types that constitute reality. According to monism, there is only one kind of thing or substance on the most basic level. Materialism is an influential monist view that posits everything is material. This means that mental phenomena, such as beliefs, emotions, and consciousness, either do not exist at all, or exist as aspects of matter, such as brain states. Idealists take the converse perspective, arguing that everything is mental. They may understand physical phenomena, like rocks, trees, and planets, as ideas or perceptions of conscious minds. Neutral monism occupies a middle ground, stating that both mind and matter are derivative phenomena arising from a more fundamental substance or principle. Dualists contend that mind and matter exist as independent principles, either as distinct substances or different types of properties. In a slightly different sense, monism contrasts with pluralism as a view not about the number of basic types, but the number of entities. In this sense, monism is the controversial position that only a single all-encompassing entity exists in all of reality. Pluralism, which is more commonly accepted, asserts that several distinct entities exist. The historically influential substance attribute ontology is a polycategorical theory. It posits that reality, at its most fundamental level, consists of unanalyzable substances, characterized by universals, such as the properties an individual substance has, or the relations between substances. Closely related is the substratum theory, which asserts that each concrete object comprises properties and a substratum. The key difference is that the substratum itself is not characterized by properties. It is a featureless or bare particular that merely supports the properties. Various alternative ontological theories deny the foundational role of substances. Stuff ontologies propose that the world is not populated by distinct entities but by continuous stuff that fills space. This stuff may take various forms and is often conceived as infinitely divisible. Process ontology holds that processes or events are the fundamental entities. This view typically emphasizes that nothing in reality is static, asserting that being is dynamic and characterized by constant change. Bundle theories state that there are no regular objects, only bundles of co-present properties. For example, a lemon may be understood as a bundle that includes the properties yellow, sour, and round. Traditional bundle theory maintains that the bundled properties are universals, meaning the same property can belong to several different bundles. In contrast, trope bundle theory asserts that properties are particular entities that belong to a single bundle. Some ontologies emphasize the interconnectedness of reality rather than focusing solely on distinct objects. According to relationalism, all of reality is fundamentally relational, meaning that relations are the primary constituents of existence. Ontic-structural realism agrees with this relational focus and delves into how these relations form complex structures. Some structural realists argue that only relations exist, implying that individual objects are merely nodes in these relational networks. Others maintain that individual objects do exist but are dependent on the structures in which they participate. Fact ontologies present a different approach by focusing on how entities belonging to various categories combine to constitute the world. Facts, or states of affairs, are seen as complex entities. For example, the fact that the Earth is a planet involves the particular object, the Earth, and the property of being a planet. Fact ontologies assert that facts are the fundamental constituents of reality, meaning that objects, properties, and relations cannot exist independently and only contribute to reality as components of facts. Throughout the history of philosophy, various ontological theories have been proposed, often based on different fundamental categories. One of the earliest and most influential systems of categories was suggested by Aristotle, who identified 10 categories: substance, quantity, quality, relation, place, date, posture, state, action, and passion. In Indian philosophy, the Vaisheshika school proposed a system with 6 categories: substance, quality, motion, universal, individuator, and inherence. Immanuel Kant, within his framework of transcendental idealism, developed a system of 12 categories, which he considered pure concepts of understanding. These categories are subdivided into 4 classes: quantity, quality, relation, and modality. In more recent philosophy, theories of categories have been developed by thinkers such as C.S. Peirce, Edmund Husserl, Samuel Alexander, Roderick Chisholm, and E.J. Lowe. The dispute between constituent and relational ontologies concerns the internal structure of concrete particular objects. Constituent ontologies posit that objects have an internal structure with properties as their component parts. Bundle theories are a prime example of this view, suggesting that objects are essentially bundles of properties. In contrast, relational ontologies assert that objects lack internal structure. Instead, properties do not inhere in objects but are externally related to them. An analogy often used is that objects are like pincushions, and properties are like pins that can be attached or removed without becoming an integral part of the objects. Relational ontologies are prevalent in certain forms of nominalism, which reject the existence of universal properties. Hierarchical ontologies propose that the world is organized into levels, with entities on all levels being real. However, lower-level entities are considered more fundamental than higher-level entities. This hierarchy implies that lower-level entities can exist independently of higher-level entities, whereas higher-level entities cannot exist without the lower-level entities. For instance, one hierarchical ontology posits that elementary particles are more fundamental than macroscopic objects like chairs and tables. Other hierarchical theories argue that substances are more fundamental than their properties, or that nature is more fundamental than culture. Flat ontologies, on the other hand, reject the notion of any entity having a privileged status. According to flat ontologies, all entities exist on the same level of reality. The primary question for flat ontologists is whether something exists, rather than identifying the hierarchical level at which it exists. Endurantism and perdurantism are ontological theories that address how material objects persist through time. Endurantism posits that material objects are three-dimensional entities that exist wholly at each moment in time. This means that an object remains the same entity even as it undergoes changes, such as gaining or losing properties. For example, a tree that loses its leaves in the fall and regains them in the spring is considered the same tree throughout these changes. Perdurantism, in contrast, holds that material objects are four-dimensional entities that extend through both space and time. According to this view, objects are composed of temporal parts, with only one part existing at any given moment. Change, therefore, is understood as a succession of different temporal parts exhibiting different properties. Using the same example of the tree, perdurantists would argue that there is an earlier temporal part of the tree with leaves and a later temporal part without leaves. Differential ontology is a post-structuralist approach focusing on the relationship between identity and difference. Traditional ontology typically prioritizes identity, first characterizing entities by their essential features and then defining differences based on these identities. Differential ontologists, however, reverse this order, arguing that difference is more fundamental. They claim that the identity of a thing is derived from its differences from other things rather than from any intrinsic, essential features. Object-oriented ontology, a part of the speculative realism movement, explores the nature and significance of objects. Object-oriented ontology considers objects as the fundamental components of reality, and adheres to a flat ontology, denying any hierarchy in the existence of entities. This means that objects exist independently of human thought and perception. Object-oriented ontology asserts that objects have their own reality and agency, existing and interacting in ways that are not fully dependent on human understanding or observation. In the Greek philosophical tradition, Parmenides was among the first to propose an ontological characterization of the fundamental nature of existence. In the prologue, or proem, on nature, he describes two views of existence. Initially, nothing comes from nothing, thus existence is eternal. This posits that existence is what may be conceived of by thought, created, or possessed. Hence, there may be either void nor vacuum, and true reality may either come into being nor vanish from existence. Rather, the entirety of creation is eternal, uniform, and immutable, though not infinite. Parmenides characterized its shape as that of a perfect sphere. Parmenides thus posits that change, as perceived in everyday experience, is illusory. Opposite to the Eleatic monism of Parmenides is the pluralistic conception of being. In the 5th century BC, Anaxagoras and Lysippus replaced the reality of being, unique and unchanging, with that of becoming, therefore by a more fundamental and elementary ontic plurality. This thesis originated in the Hellenic world, stated in two different ways by Anaxagoras and by Lysippus. The first theory dealt with seeds, which Aristotle referred to as homeomeres, of the various substances. The second was the atomistic theory, which dealt with reality as based on the vacuum, the atoms, and their intrinsic movement in it. The materialist atomism proposed by Lysippus was indeterminist, but Democritus, circa 460 to 370 BC, subsequently developed it in a deterministic way. Later, 4th century BC, Epicurus took the original atomism again as indeterministic. He saw reality as composed of an infinity of indivisible, unchangeable corpuscles, or atoms, from the Greek word atomon, literally meaning uncuttable, but he gives weight to characterize atoms, whereas for Lysippus they are characterized by a figure, an order, and a position in the cosmos. Atoms are, besides, creating the whole with the intrinsic movement in the vacuum, producing the diverse flux of being. Their movement is influenced by the parenklysis, Lucretius' names of Kleinman, and that is determined by chance. These ideas foreshadowed the understanding of traditional physics until the advent of 20th century theories on the nature of atoms. Plato developed the distinction between true reality and illusion, arguing that what is real are eternal and unchanging forms or ideas, a precursor to universals, of which things experienced in sensation are at best merely copies, and real only insofar as they copy, partake of, such forms. In general, Plato presumes that all nouns, for example beauty, refer to real entities, whether sensible bodies or insensible forms. Hence, in the Sophist, Plato argues that being is a form in which all existent things participate and which they have in common, though it is unclear whether being is intended in the sense of existence, copula, or identity, and argues, against Parmenides, that forms must exist not only of being, but also of negation and of non-being, or difference. In his Categories, Aristotle, 384 to 322 BC, identifies 10 possible kinds of things that may be the subject or the predicate of a proposition. For Aristotle, there are 4 different ontological dimensions. According to the various categories or ways of addressing a being as such, Aristotle's 10 categories include substance, quantity, quality, relation, place, time, position, state, action, and affection. These categories represent different ways in which beings can be described or classified. According to its truth or falsity, this dimension addresses whether something is genuine or fake, such as distinguishing between real gold and fake gold, or authentic currency and counterfeit money. This relates to the ontological status of things based on their adherence to a standard or their genuine existence. Whether it exists, in and of itself, or simply comes along by accident, this distinction differentiates between substances that exist independently, for example, a tree, and properties or attributes that exist only as features of substances, example, the greenness of the tree. Substances are primary beings, while other entities exist only as features or accidents of these primary beings. According to its potency, movement, energy, or finished presence, this dimension, explored in Metaphysics Book Theta, addresses the different states of being, including potentiality, the capacity to change or act, actuality, the realization of potential through movement or activity, and completeness, the state of having fulfilled potential. These dimensions illustrate Aristotle's comprehensive approach to understanding the various ways in which beings can be categorized, analyzed, and understood within the framework of ontology. Ontology features in the Samkhya school of Hindu philosophy from the 1st millennium BC. Samkhya philosophy regards the universe as consisting of 2 independent realities, purva, pure, contentless consciousness, and prakti, matter. The substance dualism between purva and prakti is similar but not identical to the substance dualism between mind and body that, following the works of Descartes, has been central to many disputes in the Western philosophical tradition. Samkhya sees the mind as being the subtle part of prakti. It is made up of 3 faculties, the sense mind, manas, the intellect, buddhi, and the ego, ahakra. These faculties perform various functions but are by themselves unable to produce consciousness, which belongs to a distinct ontological category and for which purva alone is responsible. The Yoga school agrees with Samkhya philosophy on the fundamental dualism between purva and prakti, but it differs from Samkhya's atheistic position by incorporating the concept of a personal, yet essentially inactive, deity or personal god, Ishvara. These 2 schools stand in contrast to Advaita Vedanta, which adheres to non-duality by revealing that the apparent plurality of things is an illusion, maya, hiding the true oneness of reality at its most fundamental level, Brahman. In Advaita Vedanta, Brahman is the sole reality, and everything else, including the individual soul, Atman, is considered an illusion. The perceived differences and diversities in the world are due to ignorance, avidya. According to this school, true knowledge, jnana, involves the realization that one's own Atman is identical with Brahman, leading to liberation, moksha. This ontological view asserts a non-dualistic, monistic, framework that contrasts sharply with the dualism of Samkhya and Yoga. Ontology in Buddhism also presents unique perspectives, particularly through the doctrine of anatman, non-self, and sunyata, emptiness. Buddhism denies the existence of a permanent, unchanging self or soul, proposing instead that beings are composed of 5 aggregates, or skandhas, form, sensation, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. These aggregates are in constant flux, and their interdependent nature implies that there is no underlying permanent entity. The concept of sunyata extends this idea to all phenomena, suggesting that everything is empty of inherent existence and arises dependently. Ontology in Jainism is characterized by the doctrine of anekantavada, non-absolutism, which asserts that reality is complex and multifaceted. According to this view, no single perspective can capture the full truth of an entity. Jain ontology recognizes the existence of jiva, soul, and ajiva, non-soul, with the latter further divided into categories like matter, space, time, and motion. The Chinese philosophical traditions also offer distinct ontological perspectives. Taoism, for instance, emphasizes the concept of Tao, the way, which is the fundamental, unnameable process that underlies and unifies the universe. Confucian ontology focuses on the interconnectedness of human relationships and the importance of social harmony. Buddhist influences on Chinese ontology introduced concepts of emptiness and impermanence, which were integrated into indigenous philosophical frameworks. Medieval ontology was strongly influenced by Aristotle's teachings. The thinkers of this period often relied on Aristotelian categories like substance, act and potency, or matter and form to formulate their own theories. Important ontologists in this epoch include Avicenna, Thomas Aquinas, Duns Scotus, and William of Ockham. According to Avicenna's interpretation of Greek Aristotelian and Platonist ontological doctrines in medieval metaphysics, being is either necessary, contingent qua possible, or impossible. Necessary being is that which cannot but be, since its non-being would entail a contradiction. Contingent qua possible being is neither necessary nor impossible for it to be or not to be. It is ontologically neutral, and is brought from potential existing into actual existence, by way of a cause that is external to its essence. Its being is borrowed, unlike the necessary existent, which is self-subsisting and impossible not to be. As for the impossible, it necessarily does not exist, and the affirmation of its being would involve a contradiction. Fundamental to Thomas Aquinas' ontology is his distinction between essence and existence. All entities are conceived as composites of essence and existence. The essence of a thing is what this thing is like. It signifies the definition of this thing. God has a special status since he is the only entity whose essence is identical to its existence. But for all other, finite entities, there is a real distinction between essence and existence. This distinction shows itself, for example, in our ability to understand the essence of something without knowing about its existence. Aquinas conceives of existence as an act of being that actualizes the potency given by the essence. Different things have different essences, which impose different limits on the corresponding act of being. The paradigm examples of essence-existence composites are material substances like cats or trees. Aquinas incorporates Aristotle's distinction between matter and form, by holding that the essence of material things, as opposed to the essence of immaterial things, like angels, is the composition of their matter and form. So, for example, the essence of a marble statue would be the composition of the marble, its matter, and the shape it has, its form. Form is universal since substances made of different matter can have the same form. The forms of a substance may be divided into substantial and accidental forms. A substance can survive a change of an accidental form, but ceases to exist upon a change of a substantial form. Duns Scotus introduced the notion of heicity, thisness, to account for individual differences between entities that share the same nature or essence. He argued that it is this unique aspect of an entity that makes it distinct from all others. In contrast to Aquinas, Scotus emphasized the need to recognize individual entities' singularity, rather than focusing solely on their common natures. William of Ockham is known for his principle of ontological parsimony, commonly referred to as Occam's razor. He argued that when explaining a phenomenon, one should not multiply entities beyond necessity. Occam's nominalism led him to deny the existence of universal forms or essences outside the mind, positing that only individual substances and their properties exist. Ontology is increasingly seen as a separate domain of philosophy in the modern period. Many ontological theories of this period were rationalistic, in the sense that they saw ontology largely as a deductive discipline that starts from a small set of first principles or axioms, a position best exemplified by Baruch Spinoza and Christian Wolff. René Descartes' ontological distinction between mind and body has been one of the most influential parts of his philosophy. On his view, minds are thinking things while bodies are extended things. Thought and extension are two attributes that each come in various modes of being. Modes of thinking include judgments, doubts, volitions, sensations, and emotions, while the shapes of material things are modes of extension. Modes come with a lower degree of reality since they depend for their existence on a substance. Substances, on the other hand, can exist on their own. Descartes' substance dualism asserts that every finite substance is either a thinking substance or an extended substance. This position does not entail that minds and bodies actually are separated from each other, which would defy the intuition that we both have a body and a mind. Instead, it implies that minds and bodies can, at least in principle, be separated, since they are distinct substances, and therefore are capable of independent existence. A long-standing problem for substance dualism since its inception has been to explain how minds and bodies can causally interact with each other, as they apparently do, when a volition causes an arm to move or when light falling on the retina causes a visual impression. Baruch Spinoza is well known for his substance monism, the thesis that only one substance exists. He refers to this substance as God or nature, emphasizing both his pantheism and his naturalism. This substance has an infinite number of attributes, which he defines as what the intellect perceives of substance as constituting its essence. Of these attributes, only two are accessible to the human mind: thought and extension. Modes are properties of a substance that follow from its attributes, and therefore have only a dependent form of existence. Spinoza sees everyday things like rocks, cats, or ourselves as mere modes and thereby opposes the traditional Aristotelian and Cartesian conception of categorizing them as substances. Modes compose deterministic systems in which the different modes are linked to each other as cause and effect. Each deterministic system corresponds to one attribute, one for extended things, one for thinking things, and so forth. Causal relations only happen within a system while the different systems run in parallel without causally interacting with each other. Spinoza calls the system of modes natura naturata, nature natured, and opposes it to natura naturans, nature naturing, the attributes responsible for the modes. Everything in Spinoza's system is necessary. There are no contingent entities. This is so since the attributes are themselves necessary and since the system of modes follows from them. The shift towards a modern understanding of ontology also saw significant developments with Immanuel Kant, who challenged the earlier rationalist traditions. Kant argued that many traditional metaphysical disputes could not be resolved through reason alone because they pertain to things beyond possible experience. According to Kant's critical philosophy, our knowledge is limited to phenomena, the things as they appear to us, and we can never have direct knowledge of noumena, the things in themselves. He maintained that human cognition is structured by a priori categories and intuitions, which shape our experiences. Kant's distinction between the empirical and the transcendental laid the groundwork for subsequent debates in ontology and epistemology. In the 19th century, George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel advanced a dynamic and historical approach to ontology. Hegel proposed that reality is a process of becoming rather than a collection of static entities. His dialectical method suggests that the development of the world is driven by contradictions and their resolutions, leading to progressively higher forms of understanding and being. Hegel's ontology is closely tied to his idealism, where reality is ultimately a manifestation of an absolute spirit or Geist, which unfolds through history and culture. Christian Wolff defines ontology as the science of being in general. He sees it as a part of metaphysics besides cosmology, psychology, and natural theology. According to Wolff, it is a deductive science, knowable a priori and based on two fundamental principles. The principle of non-contradiction, it cannot happen that the same thing is and is not, and the principle of sufficient reason, nothing exists without a sufficient reason for why it exists, rather than does not exist. Beings are defined by their determinations or predicates, which cannot involve a contradiction. Determinates come in three types: essentialia, attributes, and modes. Essentialia define the nature of a being, and are therefore necessary properties of this being. Attributes are determinations that follow from essentialia, and are equally necessary, in contrast to modes, which are merely contingent. Wolff conceives existence as just one determination among others, which a being may lack. Ontology is interested in being at large, not just an actual being. But all beings, whether actually existing or not, have a sufficient reason. The sufficient reason for things without actual existence consists in all the determinations that make up the essential nature of this thing. Wolff refers to this as a reason of being and contrasts it with a reason of becoming, which explains why some things have actual existence. Arthur Schopenhauer was a proponent of metaphysical voluntarism. He regards will as the underlying and ultimate reality. Reality as a whole consists only of one will, which is equated with the Kantian thing in itself. Like the Kantian thing in itself, the will exists outside space and time. But unlike the Kantian thing in itself, the will has an experiential component to it. It comes in the form of striving, desiring, feeling, and so forth. The manifold of things we encounter in our everyday experiences, like trees or cars, are mere appearances that lack existence independent of the observer. Schopenhauer describes them as objectivations of the will. These objectivations happen in different steps, which correspond to the Platonic forms. All objectivations are grounded in the will. This grounding is governed by the principium individuationis, which enables a manifold of individual things spread out in space and time to be grounded in the one will. Existentialists such as Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir further developed ontological themes related to human freedom, responsibility, and the nature of existence. Sartre's being and nothingness posits that existence precedes essence, meaning that humans first exist and then define themselves through their actions. This emphasis on radical freedom and the absence of a predetermined human nature was a central aspect of existentialist ontology. Dominant approaches to ontology in the 20th century were phenomenology, linguistic analysis, and naturalism. Phenomenological ontology, as exemplified by Edmund Husserl and Martin Heidegger, relies for its method on the description of experience. Linguistic analysis assigns to language a central role for ontology, as seen, for example, in Rudolf Carnap's thesis that the truth value of existence claims depends on the linguistic framework in which they are made. Naturalism gives a prominent position to the natural sciences for the purpose of finding and evaluating ontological claims. This position is exemplified by Quine's method of ontology, which involves analyzing the ontological commitments of scientific theories. Edmund Husserl sees ontology as a science of essences. Sciences of essences are contrasted with factual sciences. The former are knowable a priori and provide the foundation for the latter, which are knowable a posteriori. Ontology as a science of essences is not interested in actual facts, but in the essences themselves, whether they have instances or not. Husserl distinguishes between formal ontology, which investigates the essence of objectivity in general, and regional ontologies, which study regional essences that are shared by all entities belonging to the region. Regions correspond to the highest genera of concrete entities: material nature, personal consciousness, and interpersonal spirit. Husserl's method for studying ontology and sciences of essence in general is called eidetic variation. It involves imagining an object of the kind under investigation and varying its features. The change feature is inessential to this kind if the object can survive its change, otherwise, it belongs to the kind's essence. For example, a triangle remains a triangle if one of its sides is extended, but it ceases to be a triangle if a fourth side is added. Regional ontology involves applying this method to the essences corresponding to the highest genera. Central to Martin Heidegger's philosophy is the notion of ontological difference, the difference between being as such and specific entities. He accuses the philosophical tradition of being forgetful of this distinction, which has led to the mistake of understanding being as such as a kind of ultimate entity, for example as idea, energia, substance, monad or will to power. Heidegger tries to rectify this mistake in his own fundamental ontology by focusing on the meaning of being instead, a project which is akin to contemporary meta-ontology. One method to achieve this is by studying the human being, or Dasein, in Heidegger's terminology. The reason for this is that we already have a pre-ontological understanding of being that shapes how we experience the world. Phenomenology can be used to make this implicit understanding explicit, but it has to be accompanied by hermeneutics in order to avoid the distortions due to the forgetfulness of being. In his later philosophy, Heidegger attempted to reconstruct the history of being in order to show how the different epochs in the history of philosophy were dominated by different conceptions of being. His goal is to retrieve the original experience of being present in early Greek thought that was covered up by later philosophers. Nikolai Hartmann is a 20th century philosopher within the continental tradition of philosophy. He interprets ontology as Aristotle's science of being qua being, the science of the most general characteristics of entities, usually referred to as categories, and the relations between them. According to Hartmann, the most general categories are moments of being, existence and essence, modes of being, reality and ideality, and modalities of being, possibility, actuality, and necessity. Every entity has both existence and essence. Reality and ideality, by contrast, are two disjunctive categories. Every entity is either real or ideal. Ideal entities are universal, returnable, and always existing, while real entities are individual, unique, and destructible. Among the ideal entities are mathematical objects and values. The modalities of being are divided into the absolute modalities, actuality and non-actuality, and the relative modalities, possibility, impossibility, and necessity. The relative modalities are relative in the sense that they depend on the absolute modalities. Something is possible, impossible, or necessary because something else is actual. Hartmann asserts that reality is made up of 4 levels: inanimate, biological, psychological, and spiritual, that form a hierarchy. Rudolf Carnap proposed that the truth value of ontological statements about the existence of entities depends on the linguistic framework in which these statements are made. They are internal to the framework. As such, they are often trivial in that it just depends on the rules and definitions within this framework. For example, it follows analytically from the rules and definitions within the mathematical framework that numbers exist. The problem Carnap saw with traditional ontologists is that they try to make framework-independent or external statements about what really is the case. Such statements are at best pragmatic considerations about which framework to choose, and at worst outright meaningless, according to Carnap. For example, there is no matter of fact as to whether realism or idealism is true. Their truth depends on the adopted framework. The job of philosophers is not to discover which things exist by themselves, but is a kind of conceptual engineering to create interesting frameworks, and to explore the consequences of adopting them. Since there is no framework-independent notion of truth, the choice of framework is guided by practical considerations like expedience or fruitfulness. The notion of ontological commitment plays a central role in Willard Van Orman Quine's contributions to ontology. A theory is ontologically committed to an entity if that entity must exist in order for the theory to be true. Quine proposed that the best way to determine this is by translating the theory in question into first-order predicate logic. Of special interest in this translation are the logical constants known as existential quantifiers, whose meaning corresponds to expressions like there exists, or for some. They are used to bind the variables in the expression following the quantifier. The ontological commitments of the theory then correspond to the variables bound by existential quantifiers. This approach is summed up by Quine's famous dictum that to be is to be the value of a variable. This method by itself is not sufficient for ontology since it depends on a theory in order to result in ontological commitments. Quine proposed that we should base our ontology on our best scientific theory. Various followers of Quine's method chose to apply it to different fields, for example to everyday conceptions expressed in natural language. Methods of ontology are diverse and multifaceted, offering various ways to conduct ontological inquiry and evaluate competing theories. Meta-ontology studies these different approaches, as there is no single, standard method universally accepted. Conceptual analysis is a widely used method in ontology that involves dissecting ontological concepts to clarify their meaning. This method analyzes the components of a concept and determines the necessary and sufficient conditions for its application to an entity. For instance, Conceptual analysis can help determine whether entities like numbers exist by examining the concept of number and its essential characteristics. Eidetic variation is a phenomenological method aimed at identifying the essential features of different types of objects. Phenomenologists imagine an example of the type being investigated and then vary its features in their imagination to see which features are indispensable. Those that cannot be changed are considered essential to the type. The transcendental method begins with the simple observation of the existence of a certain entity. It then examines the ontological implications of this observation by exploring the conditions required for the entity's existence. This method often involves studying how the existence of an entity is possible, and what underlying structures or conditions make it so. Intuition-based methods rely on non-inferential impressions about the correctness of general principles. These intuitions serve as the foundation for building and expanding an ontological system using deductive reasoning. Another intuition-based approach employs thought experiments to evoke new intuitions. By imagining situations relevant to ontological issues and using counterfactual thinking, ontologists can assess the consequences of these situations. For example, thought experiments about creatures identical to humans but without consciousness can help explore the relationship between mind and matter. Naturalistic methods in ontology leverage the insights and discoveries of the natural sciences to determine what entities exist. An influential approach proposed by Willard Van Orman Quine suggests conducting ontology by analyzing the ontological commitments of scientific theories. This method relies on the premise that scientific theories offer the most reliable descriptions of reality. Principles of theory choice provide guidelines for evaluating the strengths and weaknesses of ontological theories, rather than for their construction. A key principle is Occam's razor, which posits that simpler theories are preferable. Simplicity can be judged in various ways, such as the use of fewer basic types or a smaller number of fundamental entities to describe the world. Ontologists also value theories with high explanatory power, meaning those that can account for a wide range of observations. Additionally, theories that align closely with common sense are often preferred, as they resonate more with ordinary conceptions and intuitions. In applied ontology, ontological engineering involves creating and refining conceptual models of specific domains. The process of developing a new ontology from scratch includes several preparatory steps. These steps involve delineating the scope of the domain to be modeled, specifying the ontology's purpose and use cases, and identifying the foundational concepts within the area. Ontology engineers then define these concepts and characterize the relations between them, typically using a formal language to ensure precision and, in some cases, automatic computability. After the initial development, a review phase assesses the ontology's validity using test data. This phase ensures that the ontology accurately represents the domain and meets its intended purposes. Various methodologies have been proposed to guide the different steps in ontological engineering. These include the Psych method, which focuses on representing common sense knowledge, Gruninger and Fox's methodology, which emphasizes the use of competency questions to guide ontology development, and methontology, a comprehensive framework that covers the entire ontology development lifecycle. Ontology overlaps with many disciplines, including logic, the study of correct reasoning. Ontologists often employ logical systems to express their insights, specifically in the field of formal ontology. Of particular interest to them is the existential quantifier, there exists, which is used to express what exists. In first-order logic, for example, the formula there exists X dog, X states that dogs exist. Some philosophers study ontology by examining the structure of thought and language, arguing that these structures reflect the structure of being. Doubts about the accuracy of natural language have led some ontologists to seek a new formal language, termed ontologies, for a better representation of the fundamental structure of reality. Ontologies are frequently used in information science to provide a conceptual scheme or inventory of a specific domain, making it possible to classify objects and formally represent information about them. This is particularly important in computer science, where databases are built to store this information and define computational processes to automatically transform and use it. For instance, to encode and store information about academic activities, A college database may use an ontology with categories such as person, teacher, student, and exam. The topic of ontology has received increased attention in anthropology since the 1990s, sometimes termed the ontological turn. This type of inquiry focuses on how people from different cultures experience and understand the nature of being. Particular interest has been given to the ontological outlook of indigenous people and how it differs from a Western perspective. For example, it has been argued that various indigenous communities ascribe intentionality to non-human entities, such as plants, forests, or rivers. This outlook is known as animism and is also found in Native American ontologies, which emphasize the interconnectedness of all living entities and the importance of balance and harmony with nature. Ontology is closely related to theology and its interest in the existence of God as an ultimate entity. The ontological argument, first proposed by Anselm of Canterbury, attempts to prove the existence of the divine. It defines God as the greatest conceivable being and concludes that God must exist since God would not be the greatest conceivable being if God lacked existence. Another overlap in the two disciplines is found in ontological theories that use God or an ultimate being as the foundational principle of reality. Martin Heidegger criticized this approach, terming it ontotheology, highlighting a perceived conflation of ontology with theological assumptions. Ontology's relationship with theology often extends to metaphysical discussions about the nature and structure of reality. The interplay between these fields raises questions about the existence and nature of spiritual or divine entities and their role in the fabric of existence. In contemporary philosophy, ontological discussions have also been influenced by advancements in science and technology. The rise of artificial intelligence and machine learning has introduced new dimensions to ontological inquiry, particularly concerning the nature of consciousness, personhood, and the potential for non-human entities to possess ontological significance. These developments challenge traditional notions of existence and necessitate a reevaluation of what it means to be. In addition to these approaches, contemporary ontology has been influenced by developments in other areas of philosophy and science. For example, in analytic philosophy, David Lewis's modal realism posits that all possible worlds are as real as the actual world, which has significant ontological implications. Furthermore, debates in the philosophy of mind, such as those concerning physicalism, dualism, and panpsychism, continue to shape ontological discourse. Advances in quantum mechanics and cosmology also challenge traditional ontological assumptions, prompting new inquiries into the nature of reality, space, time, and matter. This enduring quest to comprehend the essence of being demonstrates that the simplest questions often lead to the deepest and most intricate explorations.